The Middle Ages, kings planning wars, the church sticking its nose in everything, and nobles scheming and sneaking in the shadows. And there's a new indie game called Pitchforks and Daggers that has all these things and is inspired by real historical events and characters. So let's see how well it holds up. Also, warning, there might be some minor spoilers ahead. Full disclosure first, I was contacted by the developer and offered a key for this review. Also, I'm not a professional reviewer, I focus mostly on how games use real history. So I'll cover the basics of how the game works, but most of this video is about whether its medieval politics and characters actually match the period it's drawing from. Let's start with some quick information about what this game actually is. Pitchforks and Daggers is a choice-driven narrative game set in the fictional kingdom of Elander, which is surrounded by the kingdoms of Erwin, Wester, and Akar. You play as King Henry, your kingdom is weak, your nobles are restless, and your uncle Harold of Erwin is about to invade. And on top of all this, your wife hasn't given you an heir, which makes you a target for all sorts of conspiracies and schemes. The game plays out in 3 acts and is about an hour per playthrough. Act 1 has you judging a murder case that, depending on your decision, could spark a rebellion. Act 2 deals with navigating a potential divorce and remarriage. And Act 3 is the war with Erwin, where your earlier choices determine whether you have allies or enemies at your back. The game is designed with replayability in mind and has 11 main endings with variations. The gameplay is straightforward, there are no combat mechanics, no inventory management, just decisions and consequences, and each choice branches the story in different directions. So now let's see how its setting compares with the real Middle Ages, and despite the simple story and structure, the game handles medieval politics quite well, at least in some aspects. Number 1. Don't ignore your nobles. Early in the game, you have to judge the son of a lord who murdered a peasant. The way you deal with this problem will determine the lord's allegiances and the tolerance of the peasants. This was pretty close to how the balance of power worked during that time. Medieval kings worked through nobles, not around them. Alienating nobles could mean losing territory, losing tax revenue, and opening a gap in your defenses. One of the most famous examples of this was William the Brows. King John seized his lands, drove him into exile, and imprisoned and starved to death his wife and son. This incident became one of the indirect causes of the First Barons' War. In the end, John was forced to accept the Articles of the Barons, which later became known as the Magna Carta, so at least some good came out of all this. Number 2, the church had a say on everything. When you try to divorce Mary, all your advisors warn you that the church will object to this and you'll end up with Archbishop Stephen excommunicating you and actively preaching against you. This mirrors a real problem that Henry VIII had to face. Although the local English clergy more or less obeyed him, the Pope wouldn't grant him his divorce from Catherine of Aragon because it clashed with earlier papal rulings and also because he didn't want to piss off Emperor Charles V. So Henry broke from Rome, made himself head of the Church of England, and made Archbishop Thomas Cranmer divorce him from Catherine. This resulted to a ton of problems for him, but I guess that's one way of doing it. Number 3. Break the marriage, break the alliance. Queen Mary is the daughter of King Cedric of Wester. Your marriage secures the alliance between your kingdoms. If you don't divorce your wife and marry their younger daughter to produce an heir, they will break their alliance with you. That is accurate. Royal marriages in this period were diplomatic contracts, and there are several examples of alliances breaking when marriages broke. For example, Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's daughter, was betrothed to Charles V of Spain, but eventually Charles decided it would be better for him to break the engagement and marry someone else, which essentially ended his alliance with England. Number 4. Offing your relatives. At a couple of points in the story, you start to fear that one of your relatives might have a good chance of taking your place, so you get the option of poisoning them. Although most medieval kings preferred the more straightforward approach of arrest and execution, there are some cases where the family members were more sneakily dispatched. The most famous example of this is The Princess in the Tower. When Edward IV died, his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, became protector of his sons, Edward V, and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York. Richard of Gloucester, who later became Richard III, also had a claim to the throne, so he declared the boys illegitimate and placed them in the Tower of London. After that, they disappeared without a trace, and most people at the time believed that Richard had them quietly killed. Also, two skeletons were discovered under a staircase in 1674. They are probably the princes, although this has never been proven. The only thing that's a bit off here is the use of poison, which was much more popular in Italy than in Western Europe. Recently, several Italian nobles from the Renaissance were confirmed to have been murdered by poison after their bodies were scientifically examined. I mean, it was so common, it was practically a sport over there. So the game understands that medieval kings had constraints, nobles with power, a church with authority, alliances that break. But I think there are places where it puts modern ideas in medieval clothing. Number 1. The King and Queen's modern marriage. Throughout the game, Henry and Mary have emotionally intimate conversations. Mary asks for separate bedrooms because she's unhappy. Henry tries to mend things and apologizes when his stepmother insults her. This was unlikely to happen in a medieval royal marriage. There were some notable exceptions like Edward I and Eleanor of Castile, who spent 36 years together and traveled on crusades side by side. Edward III and Philippa of Hainault had a 41-year partnership and worked as political equals. But most royal marriages were alliances first, personal relationships later, or never. You might develop some affection over time, but the starting position was this woman secures my alliances, produces heirs, and maintains public appearances, and that's it. Number 2. The peasants taking one for your team. In Act 3, if you made pro-peasant choices earlier, for example offering compensation instead of violence, the peasants help you at crucial moments in the game. People supporting leaders they like is a modern democratic sentiment. It's not how the medieval world worked. Real peasant levies were called up through feudal obligation, not goodwill. They were poorly trained and equipped, and they'd break and run when things got bloody. Yes, peasants might not show up to a levy if they hated you. They would also not run to save a king from a losing battle, no matter how popular he was. They would wait and see and accept or rebel against whoever took over, depending on how harshly or favorably their new ruler treated them. Number 3. A commoner as a governor is a definite no-no. In one path, a noble ruler is overthrown by a peasant mob and replaced by a commoner governor. The game offers you the option to accept this. Accepting a commoner as governor is a signal that rebellion works. Every noble would see this and say, if they can kill us and install one of their own, maybe I'm next. It is an invitation for civil war. A real medieval king would crush the rebellion immediately and install a loyal noble. Or, if he's desperate and weak, he might pretend to accept the peasant demands and eliminate them the moment the external threat passes, like Richard II did with the peasants' revolt in 1381. Number 4. You don't change alliances out of spite. In the beginning of the game, depending on how you deal with the son of Lord James, he decides whether to switch alliances or not. Well, although nobles changing alliances and rebelling was a common thing in medieval times, doing so for personal reasons was unlikely. When nobles actually defected to the enemy, it was for things like money, power, religion, or after a military disaster. A real lord might wait for an opportunity, maybe join an existing faction of discontented nobles, but he wouldn't flip to the invading army because of a personal grudge. There's also the clearly modern approach to the refugees of Akkar and a couple of other things, but what about the characters? How well do they relate to their real-world inspirations? According to the developer, the inspiration behind Henry and his wife is Henry VIII and his wives. For Archbishop Stephen, it's a mix of Wolsey, Moore, and Becket, and Henry's stepmother Verena is Margaret of Anjou. Number 1. Henry. Like Henry in the game, Henry VIII's lack of male heir was an existential problem both for the continuation of his dynasty and the stability of his kingdom, and one of the main reasons for going through several wives. But here's where the similarities with Henry VIII end. He did not have any considerations for the feelings of his wives. He famously killed 2 of them when they became a liability. Anne Boleyn, because she did not produce a male heir, and Catherine Howard because she was a bit of a floozy and made him look bad. Number 2. Archbishop Stephen and the Church. The choice to have Archbishop Stephen as the main opposition to Henry seems a bit off. Unlike what you see in the game, the majority of the church establishment in England went along with Henry's whims. It was Rome that was the problem. Also, Cardinal Wolsey did not oppose Henry's divorce. He spent years trying to get the Pope to grant it. Henry wanted to execute him because he failed to secure it, not because he opposed it. As for the other inspirations for Stephen, Thomas More was a layman. He was opposed to Henry's marriage, but he kept it to himself and was executed for not accepting Henry as the head of the Church of England. Thomas Becket was murdered in his own cathedral because he opposed Henry II's legal reforms, not because of some dispute over church dogma. So, although the story the game builds up about Archbishop Stephen and the church's opposition to Henry's divorce is interesting, there isn't much connection with the story of the real Henry. Number 3. Verena. When it comes to the character that's closest to their real-world counterpart, that is surprisingly Verena, who is inspired by Margaret of Anjou, the wife of Henry VI. Verena wants to defend Elander by all means necessary. She has no problem taking over your duties while you are away. She has her own personal guard and wants to see her son king. She is also clearly scheming behind your back and can cause you trouble if you don't pay attention. Well, that sounds a lot like Margaret. She ruled over England when her husband became catatonic, and she led armies during the Wars of the Roses. She defended her son's right to the throne against the House of York. She fought and lost the crown in 1461, took it back in 1470, only to lose it finally in 1471. In the end, she died in poverty in France in 1482. Although the game does not reflect fully her abilities and personality, it comes pretty close. So, after all this, is Pitchforks and Daggers worth your time? Well, if you want a branching narrative game with a Tudor flavor and you're fine with it being inspired by rather than based on real history, then yeah, absolutely. It gets the basics of the medieval world mostly right, and even the parts where it gets it wrong rarely stand out to the point of breaking immersion. The writing is clean, the branching is functional, the consequences mostly follow logically, and the music and pixel art is really charming. It is a solid effort from a solo dev, and for the price it's a pretty good game. It's also a nice little interval from my work with Fallout New Vegas. As much as I enjoy Fallout and big history titles, it is usually the smaller indie games where you find the fun surprises. The next video will be my comparison of New Vegas with the real Las Vegas. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and Ave atque Vale.